China announced this morning that from next week they will be imposing 34% tariffs on all US goods from April 10th.
It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced massive tariffs on 180 countries around the world, and China is the hardest hit. Trump has announced 34% tariffs on all imports from China, and this is on top of the other tariffs he has imposed on China before. But China isn't going to sit back and just announced a response with similar tariffs against the U.S. This is expected to further escalate the trade war between the two countries. Hit the like and subscribe button for more updates on the U.S.-China trade war. Trump announces new global tariffs.
Effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. And starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. It's been a long time since we even thought of that. We used to think about it a lot. We didn't think about it for many decades, and you see what's happened. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating. And because we are being very kind.
Countries have been anticipating Trump's Liberation Day tariffs since the start of February, and he finally announced his global tariffs on April 2nd. He has announced a universal tariff of 10% on imports from a wide range of countries, while some others have higher rates. For instance, China is facing a 34% tariff, while the European Union will have to pay a 20% tariff on exports to the U.S. Trump has said that these new tariffs will not only earn revenue for the U.S., but also erase a trade deficit between the U.S. and other countries, including China. In his remarks, Trump said that he's doing to these countries what they have done to the U.S.
If you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad eyes. We didn't want to bring, it's very windy out here, we didn't want to bring out the big charts because it had no chance of standing. Fortunately, we came armed with a little smaller chart. So it's 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less, so how can anybody be upset?
Asian countries are facing the worst of the brunt, causing analysts to suspect that Trump is intentionally targeting this continent. Trump has also said that the new levies will boost domestic manufacturing and level the playing field with other countries. But the main problem is that Trump's new tariffs are inciting retaliations from around the world, as countries are not sitting by. Trade partners have planned to retaliate with higher tariffs on American imports to their own countries. Trump's new tariffs will become effective by April 9th, while the baseline 10% tariff goes into effect on April 5th. China is dealing with the highest tariffs from Trump right now and has announced its plan to retaliate. How high China's tariffs are.
China is known as the factory of the world. Now its exports to the US face an added 34% tariff. That's on top of the 20% imposed earlier this year.
China, first row.
The tariffs on the world's second largest economy now total 54%, the highest of those announced during the Trump administration's so-called Liberation Day. Beijing has condemned the move.
China is one of the hardest hit countries after Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, especially since Trump has imposed tariffs on them since January. China was already facing a 20% tariff imposed by Trump in January this year. This was placed on all exports from China to the U.S. and was a tense moment in their ongoing trade war. Now, Trump has announced another 34% tariff on China as part of Liberation Day, which has increased its levies to 54%. This is higher than any other country on Trump's list, with Lesotho and St. Pierre and Miquelon paying 50% tariffs on their imports to the U.S.
And that's about all that we know, in addition to additional news on tariffs from Venezuela.
Yeah, and that's another dimension, isn't it, Katy, in terms of the threat, 25%, the threat of 25% levies on anyone, any nation who buys Venezuelan oil. What are the implications of this latest move?
Yeah, it really comes in sort of when it rains, it pours. And so in addition to the tariffs, there's a slight kind of more details we got from Trump, is this tariff on any country that imports Venezuelan oil. So it's not a tariff on Venezuela, it's on countries that import.
Aside from that, Trump has imposed secondary tariffs on countries that import oil from Venezuela. If China continues to buy oil from Venezuela, it would be facing another 25% tariff on all the goods that it exports to the United States. That would increase American tariffs on Chinese goods to a whopping 79%. Trump has many other tariffs that are causing China to suffer a heavy blow. There are 25% tariffs on all foreign-made automobiles, which applies to Chinese-made cars, especially electric cars sent to the U.S. Trump also imposed a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum from all countries, another tariff that is affecting China. With all these heavy tariffs, Trump has pushed China to the brink, and they are planning to fight back. China responds to Trump's tariffs.
China has vowed to retaliate. It has called Trump's tariffs bullying.
China has repeatedly stressed that there are no winners in trade wars and tariff wars, and protectionism is not a way out. The unilateral tariff hikes by the U.S. violate WTO rules, harm the common interests of people of all countries, and do not help solve the problems of the U.S. itself. It is clear to everyone that more and more countries are opposing the U.S.'s unilateral bullying actions, such as imposing tariffs.
Once Trump announced his additional 34% tariff on China as part of Liberation Day, China immediately responded. China has announced that it would take all the necessary measures against the U.S. to protect its legitimate interests, especially because it has been hit hard by these sweeping tariffs. China firmly opposed what it called Trump's bullying tariffs and is planning to implement measures to protect its interests. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Guo Jiakun, in a briefing in Beijing said that Trump is using reciprocity as an excuse to impose tariffs on China, and this violates the rules of the World Trade Organization. The main problem is that past tariffs didn't affect smartphones and other electronics made in China, but with Trump's new tariffs, no product made in China is safe. The tariffs are expected to be a major blow to China's low-cost manufacturers, especially now that the government is trying to increase domestic demand. Although China plans to respond to Trump's tariffs with similar levies, it might also be pushed to negotiate with the U.S., especially on issues such as the sale of TikTok to a U.S.-based company. With these new tariffs, it would be less cost-effective to send products from China to the U.S. These costs will be passed on to American consumers instead. But as Chinese officials often say, there is no winner in a trade war. Now they are planning to retaliate in kind. China retaliates with 34% tariffs.
China has announced it will introduce 34% retaliatory tariffs on all goods from the United States, hitting back at Donald Trump's action earlier this week. It comes as markets continue to tumble. The FTSE is currently down, and America's Dow Jones Index suffered its biggest one-day loss since the early months of the pandemic. In a statement, the Chinese Finance Ministry said the following: the United States' imposition of so-called reciprocal tariffs seriously violates WTO rules, seriously damages the legitimate rights and interests of WTO members, and seriously undermines the rule-based multilateral trading system and international economic and trade order.
In the most recent news, China has just announced its new tariffs to retaliate against the U.S., according to its finance ministry. America's tariffs on Chinese products don't follow international trade rules. They plan to add a 34% tariff on all U.S. goods starting from April 10th. This is meant to retaliate against the 34% Liberation Day tariffs that Trump recently imposed. Once China announced its 34% retaliatory tariffs against the U.S., European markets fell further, with indexes in the UK, Germany, and France all down by over 3%. Even Asian markets were not spared and dropped further. Apart from imposing the 34% tariffs, China has already filed a lawsuit against U.S. tariffs with the World Trade Organization. In a press conference, the spokesperson at the Ministry of Commerce had said, "It is a typical unilateral bullying practice that endangers the stability of global economic and trade order. China firmly opposes this."
China has also added 16 entities from the US, 16 US companies to an export control list. And it's also added restrictions on some rare earth-related materials, samarium, gadolinium, terbium, and scandium. We still need to get more details as to what that would involve, but many U.S. companies rely on China. It is the biggest exporter of rare earth materials as well. Important to note, though, that there's still 5 days before this comes into effect, so I think Beijing is making an indication to the Trump administration there is still time.
China has also announced new restrictions on U.S. companies. It has added 16 U.S. entities to its export control list, using national security as an excuse. This will ban the export of dual-use items from China to these entities. It has also put 11 foreign entities on its unreliable entity list and suspended the export qualifications of 6 U.S. companies, with food safety as the reason. Another move by China is its new export controls on 7 rare earth elements, which are important in the production of consumer electronics. This is escalating the trade war between the U.S. and China even further. China's resolute countermeasures against the U.S. have worsened the trade war between the two countries, and now everyone's watching to see how Trump would respond to these new restrictions, bans, and levies. According to analysts in Greater China, the Chinese government would probably respond to the U.S. by further boosting domestic production and also strengthening ties with trading partners. Aside from the retaliatory tariff and bans on U.S. entities, China is now focusing on improving its economy and diversifying its export destinations and products, especially since it's more expensive to trade with the U.S. The Chinese president has also been working on boosting domestic consumption, and this would reduce its reliance on the U.S. China faces all-round blockage.
The trade pattern between the United States and China is not going to be sustainable economically and politically. We're preparing for this, that we can't rely on the U.S. market forever. The party is going to end. This probably is going to end a little bit earlier than a lot of people expect.
China is most exposed to Trump's new tariffs, especially since the country sells over $400 billion in goods to the United States each year and is one of America's biggest trade partners. Before Trump's re-election in November, many Chinese manufacturers had been expecting the tariffs, and so they started relocating some of their production facilities to Southeast Asia and other regions. These included Vietnam and Thailand. Chinese exporters have been trying to avoid the impact of the trade war by moving some of their production abroad and also increasing sales to non-U.S. markets. But this might also be harder because of the worldwide tariffs that Trump has now placed on other countries. So even if they open their factories in Vietnam or other Asian countries, they will face similar tariffs. Vietnam is facing a 46% tariff from the U.S., while Thailand will get a 36% tariff. Other places also have tariffs of at least 10%, making it difficult for these manufacturers regardless of where they are based. These new tariffs could deal a major blow to global demand. China is exposed to the risk of a shrinking commerce more than any other country, especially since its economic growth mostly relies on a $1 trillion trade surplus. Some Chinese stakeholders have called Trump's latest move an all-round blockade against China. Asia's supply chain affected.
It really depends if those things pan out, because the reality is that China has a close to $1 trillion trade deficit with the world. That means that it's just heavily exporting these goods still, and that's where the growth is coming from, is the reality. So if these consumer-focused programs work out, perhaps they could shift some growth that way, but so far that's not been the case.
Trump's heavy tariffs on China are just the start, as other Asian countries are also dealing with heavy tariffs. Countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have to pay tariffs from 46% to 49% when exporting goods to the U.S. This has led to a major assault on Asia's extended supply chain. Vietnam and other countries are going to end up as collateral damage in Trump's aggressive trade policies, especially since their retaliations might not have a major impact on America's economy. Meanwhile, countries like Laos and Cambodia, some of the poorest in the Asian region, are highly reliant on Chinese investment in supply chain infrastructure. These high tariffs would hit these countries hard, as China can no longer protect itself. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner. At the same time, the U.S. is Vietnam's biggest export market. In Trump's first administration, he hit China with tariffs, causing some businesses to shift their manufacturing to Vietnam. This led to an increase of exports from Vietnam to the U.S., and many Chinese companies moved their production there. But Vietnam is now dealing with its own high tariffs from the U.S. Trump's levies on China and the Asian region would also affect U.S. companies that manufacture their goods in Southeast Asia. Trump's tariffs on other Asian countries.
So 16 Asia-Pacific countries made the list, which we know includes Japan, there's China, Korea, Vietnam, and also Singapore. The number ranges as high as 49%, with Singapore the only one that has a baseline tariff. I mean, are these numbers in line with what you were expecting?
Well, to be honest, we're still trying to figure out where these numbers came from. The justification for tariffs on South Korea and Malaysia, for example, were because they allegedly have tariffs of up to 50% on U.S. goods.
Trump's Liberation Day tariffs have put all of Asia into the same boat. China is already facing a possible 79% tariff from the U.S. and additional levies on steel, aluminum, and car imports. What's more, Chinese exports who have been rerouting goods through Southeast Asia to avoid tariffs have found themselves in square one. Meanwhile, Japan has gotten a 24% tariff despite being America's geopolitical linchpin in Asia and having investments from giants like SoftBank. India is also facing 27% tariffs from the U.S. and might use this opportunity to expand its manufacturing sector. South Korea is known as one of America's closest partners with a lot of U.S. Army bases, but it is still facing a 26% tariff from the U.S. Even Taiwan, which supplies semiconductors for Silicon Valley titans, has to pay a 32% tariff on all the exports to the U.S. But Trump's decisions are giving Asian countries the incentive to work together, which might eventually isolate the U.S. China, South Korea, and Japan recently held their first economic talks in 5 years and plan to speed up their discussions for free trade. Asia markets drop after Trump's tariffs.
The shock has been felt instantly in the country's markets. When they opened, key indexes fell between 1% and 3%, but the fall has not been limited to Asia. US futures trading shows investors expect a drop when Wall Street reopens. The Dow Jones, S&P 500 and Nasdaq futures are all down. China has called the US tariffs typical unilateral bullying practice and promised to take countermeasures.
Once Trump announced his new Liberation Day tariffs, it caused markets in Asia to fall. In Asian trading, Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index dipped 4%, causing automakers and banks to suffer a big hit. As for Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, their shares dropped by 7.2% due to the impact of Trump's 24% tariffs against Japan. Sony Corp stocks dropped by 4.8%, while Toyota Motor Corp sank by 5.2%. In South Korea, the benchmark Kospi fell 1.1% after the announcement of the tariffs. Hong Kong's Hang Seng also fell by 1.7%, while the Shanghai Composite Index declined by 0.2%. Bangkok's ESET dropped by 1.1% too, as Thailand is dealing with a 36% tariff. After China announced its 34% retaliatory tariffs against the U.S., it caused markets to fall even more. It especially affected European markets, like UK's FTSE 100 and Germany's DAX, which dropped by 4%.
Yeah, I think if you were in any doubt that we are now in the midst, engaged in a trade war, rather than just talking about the potential of one in future, then that has been dispelled.
China's latest move has caused a major blow to the United States. What's more, China is blocking different U.S. entities from operating smoothly in its country. Trump's new tariffs have wide-reaching impacts on both the U.S. and China. How do you think Trump would respond to China's retaliation? Let's know your thoughts in the comments.